So this talk is called Coherence of Experience from Distributed Embryonic Experiences to Fetal Integration of Single Conscious Agency. So it's a bit of a mouthful, but I hope it makes sense as we move along. So the overview of the talk and really the summary of it, I'll just give right at the front because it will help to make sense of the thing as we move along. Effectively, there's a disjunction, I believe, between the nature of embryonic experiences and fetal experience. So embryonic experiences of the embryo, are characterized by their molecular and cellular systems. They're organized by cells that are interacting with each other, and they're not organized so much as the organism or the embryo at this stage, because that's the nature of its stage in development. They're not organized by its interaction with the environment, because this interaction with the environment as a whole agent is minimal, to say the least. But in fetal development, which is the difference between the embryo as a developing cellular system to the fetus, and what characterizes the distinction there is a fetus has all of the major organs and body plan parts that we see in adulthood already present, and just at the beginning of the fetal period, just beginning to become operational. So a fetus is like a miniature adult, as it were, if you could just shrink and simplify everything, but you still have all the parts, the digits of the hand, the eyes, the ears, the brain, the spinal column, and so on, but simplified, yeah? So it's in its simplest form. And this shift between the embryonic and the fetal period occurs between the first and second trimester, approximately. And it's a kind of gradation of transition. Begins about 7 weeks or 8 weeks gestational age, and the kind of consensus that it's finished by about 12 or 14 weeks. Certainly by 12 weeks, I would say, gestational age. So that kind of boundary between the first and the second trimester. So this helps us to understand the early development of human consciousness or human mind. Forgive me if I'm being sloppy, but because the two are distinctively different biological phenomena, and we can look at a little bit at the organization of that as the talk goes on. So the old question that we're pursuing here is, when does a conscious human life begin? You know, is it when the baby is born? Is it when the baby is 9 months and is able to stand up almost? Is it when the language first comes on at the 18-month point? So when does that infant first become a conscious agent in and of itself? This position has changed remarkably over the 20th century. In the mid 20th century and the preceding decades before, infants were thought to be rather mindless or non-conscious. They were simply reactive and automatic entities. And kind of famous examples are, pain in infants were not considered to be conscious pain. Therefore, it was okay to perform operations without analgesics to numb that pain. However, in the 1950s, Spitz and Bowlby, the two famous psychiatrists, were doing studies of so-called hospitalism, and then Bowlby's famous orphanage studies that showed that infants were failing to thrive even though all the science was correct. So the science was correct, but the baby simply failed to thrive. And what they found that was missing, of course, was what one might call love or nurturing care. So the touch, the maternal touch or paternal touch, and that loving interaction with the baby, being held, touching the skin, hearing the voice of the mother, being what we would call in common parlance loving or caring for that infant. And when infants who were failing to thrive, and that's a clinical term, received so-called love, they ceased failing to thrive, and they thrived by and large. Okay, so science was missing an ingredient back then. That understanding had developed over the latter part of the 20th century, especially with people like Brazelton, who was a pediatrician at Boston Children's Hospital, Daniel Stern in New York, Beatrice Beebe in New York, and Colwyn Trevarthen, who's my colleague here in Scotland. And they all worked to understand this very sensitive, intentional dynamic which is an intersubjective between two subjectivities dynamic between the baby and the caregiver, the mother, the father, or the caregiver. And the responsiveness of that baby demonstrated a intentional conscious awareness and an agency or an intention to interact. And this has all been documented by a lot of work over the past, I would say now 50 years, right? 40 or 50 years. So we now understand infants are conscious agents with feelings, perceptions, and choice that develop from the very beginning of life, from birth, and it becomes a layered structure. So we're beginning to understand a little bit more about that layered structure. To get into this a little bit more precisely, I borrowed from panpsychism. So my background is in developmental biology. I grew up in a lab which was in a sense an outcrop of Waddington's lab. And Waddington, of course, was a very famous biologist who was influenced by Whitehead. So I began reading Whitehead quite early on. And of course, Whitehead then introduced me to Leibniz and Timothy Sprigg, who was the late professor of metaphysics at Edinburgh. The core notion here is that, what they say, and what I'm taking away from that metaphysical piece of work, is that the mind-matter unity, this actual occasion or actual entity, to use Whitehead's parlance, is a bipolar mind-matter event, but it's a discrete unit. So if it's a mind-matter unit, then it must be something observable. These are active psychophysical units, and this is the essence of Whitehead's philosophy of organism. It's the stuff of the universe are these actual occasions, right? So each unit is alive with feeling and with intention, but perhaps not intention in the way that we were talking about it earlier today. These are little immanent teleologies. One nice way of putting it is that the universe is made of feeling, so subject, transitive, verb, object. And what these units of feeling intention look like in human life, I think, is the work of science or a good natural science. So this is the kind of actual occasion, the Whitehead's ontological unit. It's one unit of prehending, integrating those prehensions according to a subjective aim, and objectifying out or actualizing those particular experiences in concrete physical actualities, that it can be shared with others, and that's how it becomes physical. Okay, I just want to take that piece and move back into the ontogenesis of human agency, human conscious agency. You can see in this image that infant has will, has agency, is striving to achieve, to move forward in time, to do something. And that conscious agency we can treat as being an intentional sensory motor agency. So the organism is sensing and moving with its own intentional purpose, right? It tells us about how the brain is organized or how the body is organized. This is Roger Sperry, who won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in the 1980s. He says motor coordination is the sole product of brain function. So motor coordination, the actual output, as it were, the objectification of subjective experience, is accessible to empirical study. We can measure it, right? We can put wearables on it now. We can look at the spatiotemporal characteristics of it. We can measure it in a laboratory, and we can infer the neurophysiology, and we can actually look at the neurophysiology as well. So primary sensory motor intentions is something that allows us to understand this very early development of agency. So actions are prospective by necessity. So this is now trying to define intentions, not as being these abstract, reflective, conceptually backed intentions, but now we want to increase our technical precision in how we understand the word intentionality and look at the development of intentionality as being the expression of agency in an organism. Because actions are biomechanical, they create inertial forces. Those forces in the organism have to be compensated for ahead of time. And they have to be controlled with adaptive effect in order to reach the goal or the target. So if I'm reaching to grab my glass of water, my motor impulse to initiate that action generates forces within the arm that have to be counteracted before it reaches the glass, or it's just going to knock it over. But they have to be strong enough that I reach the glass and then can then grasp it and pick it up and have a drink. So this is the prospective nature of agent action, is that it anticipates or it has knowledge of what is about to come. Brentano makes it clear that every mental phenomena includes something as object within itself. So that something of object, we reasoned in this particular paper, is born of the necessity of prospective control. Because we have to know ahead of time to move our body where that body part is going, even if we're not aiming towards an external goal, just to counteract the physical forces of inertia and momentum, we have to know something about the future. So our sensory motor organization is necessarily prospectively organized. So when we create an action, it's got a degree of intentionality to it. And that's what we're defining as primary intentionality or primary sensory motor intentionality, to remove it from this very cumbersome word of the standard idea of intentions. So this is a baby. You can have a look at this newborn baby. This is about 2 days old. We've attached markers to look at the movement of the arms going up and down the body. The baby's with the father. And you can see this baby seems to be perceptive, alive, coherent, and making expressive actions that are meaningful within the context of its particular relations with its father and its particular internal feelings, feeling tired in this case, right? So the old pediatric story would say, well, those actions are simply reflexes that are automatic, that are initiated by brainstem or spinal column systems, but they don't actually engender purpose or mentality within and of themselves. But we reasoned that they're too finely controlled to do so. So we wanted to analyze them mathematically according to a theory of prospective control of movement, and look at those movements to see if they agreed with the theory. And the take-home message from this is that 75% of healthy term birth babies were making these prospectively organized movements, and that was significantly reduced, but subtly, to about 68% of the movements in prematurely born babies who would later go on to develop neurodevelopmental disorder. So the story here is that these are primary intentions. They're simple, they're pre-reflective, they're preconceptual, but they're future-oriented. Right? They're under the agent's direction, yeah? And they're expressive of that agent's feeling. So the question is, from whence does that come? Because a baby doesn't just appear out of thin air at 9 months. It has 9 months of gestation. So we did some fetal ultrasound studies with colleagues, and this is a 14-week gestational age fetus. You can see the skull here. This is the mouth area. These are the digits of the hand. This is the belly, these are the legs, and they're kicking up against the uterine wall, and that's the spongy placenta there. And you can see again, just subjectively, that this is a coherent, organized movements. They're not random Parkinsonian, jerky, reflexive movements. They appear to be doing something that's under the control of the fetus. At the same time we were looking at this, colleagues in Italy were doing similar studies and doing proper, so we didn't have the opportunity to do the computational stuff, but they did, and they found that by 14 weeks gestational age, twins and twin pregnancies would reach to touch the other twin with different action patterns than they would do to reach to touch the placental lining or the uterine wall. But the same action pattern that they would use to touch themselves. So there was a differentiation of inanimate and animate objects in its environment, as it were. And there were, in another study, they found action planning, according to another analysis, clearly evident by 18 weeks gestational age. So there was a growing body of evidence to show that actually these movements of the fetus are anticipating their effects, right? They're anticipating the outcome of the action that's being generated in that particular moment. So that's prospectively organized action. Alessandro Piontelli has a wonderful catalog of fetuses, showing them bicycling, reaching to grasp, touching the face, Miyoa Yamakoshi and Takashita have a series of papers, and also now Nadia Riceland and Durham, showing that the hand-to-mouth movements in fetus, the mouth anticipates being touched by the hand. In other words, there's a prospective awareness, a future awareness of the consequences of a self-generated action. So this is primary consciousness as we understand it. It's mediated, interestingly, by the upper brainstem or midbrain region. So this is the subcortical region. And it's what Jaak Panksepp, who's the father of affective neuroscience, calls the core self. Yeah, this is the core self, the brainstem mediated region. It's anatomically subcortical, so it sits under the cortex, but it's functionally supracortical because it organizes the activity of the cortex. It's connected to skeletomusculature by about 14 weeks gestational age, so it can organize those prospective actions. And it's conscious and acts with felt appraisal, so it understands the consequences of an act and can adjust those actions ahead of time according to its expectations, right? So am I touching a twin with the movement and feeling, or am I touching the uterine wall, which is for all intents and purposes an inanimate object? Phil Wynne calls the brainstem a site of affective learning and memory, and it's evidenced in anencephalic and hydranencephalic children who are born without cerebral cortices. Yeah, so this is the region. This is the brainstem and midbrain region that's at the center of the encephalon. Yeah, so this is the centroencephalic theory. This is going back to Penfield and Jasper of the 1950s. But cognitive neuroscience and medicine would say all conscious activities coming from the cortex, this bit that's shaded out, and everything here is automatic. You know, and this is the big divergence of opinion, is that now all of neuroscience is focused on this shaded out region. But what's interesting is you don't need that shaded region to be conscious, have intentions and feelings, and engage with people purposefully. Now, this is a paper from a paper by Bjorn Merker, who's a neurologist at Uppsala. And he makes the point that hydranencephalic and anencephalic children, these are children born without cerebral cortices. So this is standard anatomical MRI. The black space here should be full of white tissue, brain, cortex, but it's not. They're born without it. They have in the midbrain, there's a little bit of residual, I think it looks like residual V1, so visual cortex there. That's the cerebellum, the brainstem, and midbrain regions, but they don't have a cortex at all, well, except a little bit of V1. Yet they can live for several years. They can engage in relationships with their siblings. This is a hydranencephalic 3-year-old girl with her baby brother. And they can have emotional engagement with their parents and with others. But sadly, these children, because we are highly evolved to depend on the cortex, especially later in childhood, they often don't live for very long. And that's because autonomic systems, heart rate regulation, and so on, come in later childhood to become controlled by the cortex or require that. However, it teaches us that the cortex is not necessary to be conscious, to have feelings, to act with intentions, to perceive and appraise the environment, to engage socially and purposefully with others, and to learn. And this is corroborated by surgically decerebrated cat and rat experiments where neuroanatomists would go in and remove the cortex from cats or rats, but these animals would still be able to navigate over tricky terrain, perform elaborate courtship rituals, mate and wean litters, all without a cerebral cortex. So the fact that science and neuroscience in particular is focused so heavily on the cerebral cortex is a bit of a mystery. And some of my work is obviously to push this back into more primitive systems. But what panpsychism, for me, offers us is explanatory power, why these basic brainstem systems, which are not thought to be conscious and are not part of the attention of cognitive neuroscience, might in themselves be able to generate sentience, so conscious sentience and capacity to act with knowledge and with the power of one's own agency. And this is the nub of it. You know, making sense of the world is what human animals certainly do, and most all animals do as well, especially as they're developing. And once they've got a sense of that, then they try to maintain it. But it's mediated by the brainstem, and the brainstem is the part of the neuroanatomy that we do share and is almost entirely common with all other mammals and most other vertebrates. So it's this common ancestor that we all share. It's probably why neuroscience disregards it, because it likes to think of us as being superior. Anyway, the brainstem-mediated primary conscious is pre-reflective, pre-conceptual conscious experience. It's prospective and anticipatory. It's affective and evaluative with feeling for the vital gain of the organism. It's what we call, what I'm beginning to understand as phenomenal consciousness, which is not yet so-called access consciousness. In other words, it's not the reflective, conceptually backed consciousness is able to reflect on previous experience. It's more direct, immediate experience. But this brainstem has access to the external senses, exteroception, so the eyes, the ears, the nose, and touch. It's got direct access to those particular sensory features. It has interoception, so knowledge of the heart rate, the blood oxygenation, temperature, and nutrition or energy levels, and proprioception, so the body and movement. It knows where the body is going. That kind of that triangle, that triad of perceptual experience locates the organism, and from that information, the organism is able to act with its own particular agent intentions, its own particular intention to engage the world at a level, at a more basic level of meaning. Then we have secondary consciousness, where learning and higher order systems of habits and operant conditioning come into play with improved perceptual discriminatory abilities and so on. And finally, we have this kind of cortex-mediated tertiary consciousness, which we know so much about, which is abstract reflective thought that allows planning, offline imaginations, development of language, mathematical skills, and all the rest of it, right? So it's pretty amazing, but it's not essential. This is the point. So Searle, I think, is a good one here. He said this would be the seat of Searle's intentions to act, in contrast to the brainstem seat of intention actions as a conglomerate there. So this cortex is access consciousness on top of phenomenal conscious, or mixed in together with phenomenal consciousness. So this is a diagram I like very much from Jaak Panksepp. I mean, Jaak Panksepp is credited, I think, with really most of the work in understanding this. But he sums it up in this traffic light diagram, where you have these primary process emotions. You can call this primary consciousness here at the bottom level. It gets nested into secondary process limbic, so that it feeds into those secondary process limbic, and at the same time, those are feeding down and organizing the primary processes. And then these feed up into tertiary process, or cortically mediated, now reflective, consciously elaborated and linguistically elaborated experiences that can top-down regulate the secondary ones, which in turn top-down regulate the primary ones. And altogether, this is condensed in the immediate moment. So this is the immediate moment of experience in time, cuts across all of those layers, bringing in the remembered past, together with the anticipated future. And in their paper, they were comparing it to Freud's old idea of the ego and the id. And the title of their paper, which is very nice, "The id knows more than the ego admits." The idea being here is that the id, which Freud called unconscious, is in fact conscious in the sense that it has knowledge of its own particular situation, and it's acting with its own agency, as it were. And a lot of the psychopathology, of course, is a struggle of the agencies of the id with the agencies of the ego, and later the superego. And you have conflict between the three of them. In my work with kids with autism, this is becoming quite clear as being something that's also a model that's really important for understanding autistic experience and the incoherence of autistic experience in children and adults. Now, all of this activity has to happen over time, and this is the spatiotemporal domains, as it were, these different levels. So this primary level of reaching to grasp and putting it in my mouth, each one is a step. It takes place under a second typically, but put those together and you have a project that takes about 3 seconds, taking a drink of water, putting one hand in front of the other to reach for the door, one foot in front of the other to walk. But then you had tertiary projects to go further with increased action. I want to walk to the dance hall to have a good time with my friends. Now that's going to take place over maybe many minutes and many hours, right? So each level allows you extension of your awareness and capacity to engage with greater domains of space and time. It all begins at the very beginning of life in small projects. These are social. This is a neonatal young baby engaging with the mum, trying to latch onto the breast. They have to engage and coordinate their subjective experiences and their intentions so that they can complete a shared project together. When the project is completed and latching occurs, and this is a non-trivial task, often it takes grandmothers or nurse midwifery to be able to assist in the project, satisfaction ensues, right? So you get an affective value out of it, which sustains life and sustains, I would say, mental health and good quality experiences. Of course, in child development, this becomes more sophisticated, and the projects become more sophisticated, but they're also shared with others. And again, that affective quality of joy or in the successful completion of an act. So I know I'm running over, but I want to just quickly move into the embryonic place, and then I'll wrap up, if I may. Because all of that is known now. That's the bit that we're pretty certain about, that we have this development in conscious agency from this point at the second trimester of gestation. But there's something that's peculiar about this embryonic stage, this transition from the embryo to the early fetus, because it's different. All of the stuff that happens afterwards is neurally mediated, and it's just a case of different gradations of neurally mediated sensory motor action becoming learned, abstracted into concepts or language, and developed with different cognitive tools. But something is unique because it's the division between a biological experience and a particularly human neurally mediated sensory motor founded experience of human life. And that's what I want to get at. And I don't have specific answers, but I have observations to give today, and we can discuss it. So this is the growth of the human organism. This is the last menstruation, so fertilization taking place, at least in this chart, at 2 weeks. And then we move forward, and of course, at the 40-week point is standard normal birth. But of course, there's always a lot of difference and lots of healthy difference between the two. The 50% survival chance is at about 23 to 24 weeks. So from this point onward, the fetus can live by itself, still with assistance, of course, as it does even if it's born at term, but is a fully integrated, viable organism, right? So it's autonomous. But below that point, it still requires so-called amphoteronomic or autonomic regulation with the mother, and it certainly needs that. What's interesting is the first signs of intentional motor control, or that prospective motor agency, occurs at about this point, at about the 14-week gestational point. These two charts are not exactly aligned. The first neurally mediated movements of the embryo occur at 7 weeks, 2 days gestational age. Which is that just at the very end of that transition from being an embryo to being a fetus. But whether these are conscious or agentive of their own, I don't think so, because they're simply impulsive. They're writhing movements like an earthworm, moving in its whole body. But at this point, at 14 weeks gestational age, you have isolate movements of the limbs to touch things, like to reach and to grab a glass of water, or to reach and touch the face, or to reach and touch the twin. So that's a distinct, it requires a distinct perception, a discriminative perception of its environment, and a choice in the form of movement to engage in that environment. And therefore it's expectant of the results of that. Yeah, this is primary consciousness in my vocabulary. Before that, we don't really have evidence of that. We don't have evidence of that knowledge, but it's that coming on stream. So what makes us so remarkably different is that all the embryonic period before, the embryo is not acting as a whole organism interacting with its environment. Rather, it's acting internally. It's internal processes. And these processes are cellular and molecular processes. So this is a fertilized ovum at the very beginning of conception. It quickly divides into 2 cells. It quickly divides into 4 cells, then 8, and so on. It moves it into the morula stage and the blastocyst stage, I think as fast as 5 days. So it's very, very quick. You can see the cartoon diagram of that here. It's not interacting with its environment. It's only interacting internally. But each cell is itself a contained whole. And we know that because we can take the morula or blastocyst stage. This is a pig embryo. and extract, so shake it about, and extract the individual cells, and they can become stem cells, right? And those stem cells can differentiate and form any body part, and if you do it well, you can get a whole organism out of it. I show this picture as well because it shows very clearly. This is an actual micrograph, or it's from a dissecting microscope. The kind of delicate intricacy of the cells and the way that they are individuals, but since they've been shaken about, they're not compacted into their little community of interaction, but they're being extracted. But they have totipotency in the sense that they can become all the cells of a future organism. So these cellular experiences, these embryonic experiences, are integrations of cellular experiences, and these cellular experiences are integrations of molecular experiences. But there's no singular sensory motor agent. There's no single agent happening, giving coherence and directedness to the whole thing, except the DNA, which organizes it all. But the DNA is hidden. And it was interesting listening to Tim, because it's almost as if the cells have to discover the DNA as they proceed along their path of development. So the DNA gets unwrapped and unraveled and expresses new proteins which afford new possibilities in the environment in a similar, not in a dissimilar way from the farmer, plowing the field and expressing new potential with the seeds that go in it. And each step leads to new potentiality. And the farmer has the foresight to be able to understand what's coming next. I don't know that that's going to be true of the particular embryonic or molecular experiences. So structurally, it's different than fetal coherence of experience. And I think this is a really interesting point and a point of further investigation. Each of these individual cells can become a new organism. Interacting with each other, they become that new organism, right? So it's a diffuse and distributed experience of molecules within cells as cohesive units of activity, and then intercellular communication giving cohesion to that activity as a whole embryo, right? And of course, what panpsychism teaches us is that each molecule within the cell and each cell within the system, and each system can have its own sense of agency at each local level. So I'm just finishing off now, and then we're done. And the embryonic level, you have molecular organization, you have cellular organization and cell systems organization, each one integrating experience. Altogether, this leads to organ function, which transitions us into the fetal stage. So organ function integration. Now you have heart working with lungs, for example, working with liver, and you have inter-organ system integration within the whole organism. And as we've seen, by about 23, 24 weeks gestational age, all of that can work together as a cohesive whole to survive. But interestingly, the nervous system comes to control it all. And the nervous system is a bit like the invader. It's a particular tissue that's developing with all of the other organ systems, but it innervates and comes to control all of those other organ systems and bring them under its dominant control. And that's a very curious thing. So the entity as a whole in the embryonic stage does not have agency of the kind that a mid-gestation fetus does. But the mid-gestation fetus only has the agency that it has because its nervous system innervates the fabric of the body, as it were, to come to sense it, to coordinate its actions or its particular experiences, and then to control them, right? And this is a bit like, you could say, it's almost like the nervous system grows on top of the mesoderm and the ectoderm, the mesoderm and the endoderm, the other cell tissue types. Like a plant grows on top of the soil, but it's dominant. It's also controlling and feeding off of them as well. So it's a very, very peculiar thing. So we understand the neural conscious nested nature of a human mind, and that's very clear from Jaak Panksepp's work. We're now perhaps can start to understand non-neural or pre-neural conscious experiences, and understand the differences between them as being primary process molecular experiences leading to secondary process cellular experiences leading to tertiary process cell systems experiences. But how the two interrelate, I think, is an open question. I think we don't know quite how they relate. So that's the sum of my talk, really, and that's, I think, the point that I'm at least in understanding this, is that embryonic experiences are distributed and very sort of internal focused experiences that are organized within cells and cell systems. But fetal experiences become something unique and very common to our adult human experience, which is neurally mediated into a coherent whole that's able to act with a singular purpose, reaching for the glass, speaking these words in serial order, and so on. And how these two interact, I'm just not sure. Okay, thank you very much.